Welcome to Chapter 24, The 20s. The 20s bring America back into this period of privatism or non-involvement in world politics and world affairs. You might say we focused on isolationism, just the U.S. being the U.S. and having less involvement in international affairs. Coming off of World War I, we're concentrating on rebuilding us at this point. Harding is elected president. He accomplished very little during his time, and we know him now as a very corrupt president, and this video will explain a little more about that. Upon Harding's death, Vice President Coolidge is sworn into office. He also does very little in terms of presidential accomplishments, but he does restore some dignity and honesty to the office. He did very little to address social and economic issues, and he was actually known for his silence and inactivity while in office. So the 20s ushered in prosperity. We have a government who is very pro-business, and we also see society changing, and this image of all these cars, can you believe it? It's a traffic jam. Now, we had traffic jams back during the old days with horse and carts, but started to spread to the suburbs as well when we have all these autos that became very popular in the 1920s. So we have this emerging difference between the old and new America. The old America being prior to World War I and new America being post-World War I. One of the issues that kind of crossed between old and new America was the wet versus dry issue, prohibition. Prohibition was a cultural issue. The Volstead Act of 1919 provided enforcement for the 18th Amendment, prohibiting the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. The act was vetoed by President Woodrow Wilson, but Congress voted to override his veto, and it took effect then in 1920. And the wet versus dry issue is something you'll still hear discussed today, especially if you live in Hot Spring County, because so many neighboring counties have adopted the wet county aspect that now, Hot Spring County is still dry, so they're considering, should we sell alcohol or not. It's not on the ballot yet, but there are people who've been talking about it for some time now, so we'll see when that comes up on the local ballots. Also, we have xenophobia developing in New America. It's this fear of foreigners, and that really kind of puts a damper on the United States stance on immigration. It really starts to halt immigration. New America also begins to have this Red Scare, this fear of people from Eastern Europe, communist. The Johnson-Reid Immigration Act comes about in result to this xenophobia and this Red Scare. It provides for a literacy test to demonstrate basic reading in any language. It increased new immigrant taxes upon arrival. It excluded some people from Asiatic barred zones except Japanese and Filipinos. The Japanese had already limited their own immigration into the United States, and Filipinos from the Philippines were U.S. nationals since it was considered a U.S. territory. The Johnson-Reid Immigration Act also limited immigration by limiting visas to 350,000 per year. It did not include restrictions for anyone, however, from the Western Hemisphere. President Wilson opposed the restrictions and vetoed it in 1921, but when Harding was elected president, he called a special session of Congress and passed it. In terms of African American achievement in this new America, more blacks moved north. We saw an influx of African American migration from the south to the north during the war for those good wartime jobs. So this post-war time sees more African Americans moving north for those jobs, and some found new opportunities there. One particular person of note is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard, but more importantly, he co-founded the NAACP and was the organization's publicity director. He identified himself as biracial and attended school with whites. Teachers were impressed by him. So he did not have that traditional segregated experience that we often think of, especially when we talk about African American education in the South. Another new idea that comes about after World War I is this Back to Africa movement. One person who promoted that was Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican activist and journalist. Some of these ideas that he developed became known as Garveyisms. So the idea that African Americans should move back to Africa was something he promoted, specifically migration to Liberia. Garvey worked with the KKK to keep racial separatism and segregation as the forefront, which was unlike Du Bois, who promoted integration and equality through the NAACP. But by promoting this separatism, this racial separatism, Garvey tried to steer more African Americans into this movement, this migration to Liberia. He contended that African Americans needed financial independence from a white dominant society and said that Liberia was the place to do that. He was actually jailed in 1923 for mail fraud for selling stock in Liberia, and he was deported to Jamaica in 1927. Then he moved to London in 1935. The good thing about Garvey was that he encouraged pride and self-worth among African Americans. You know, this sentiment isn't something that we usually associate with post-World War I. You know, we think of it today as current, but one of the problems with the New America was that family values were eroding. And people at the time said that the media assault on small town life was to blame for the erosion of family values. You know, it seems kind of ridiculous to think about today from our current modern perspective because we have so much media coming at us from all directions. And back then they did not. You know, they might have had a radio broadcast or a newspaper or magazine. That was about it, in addition to the propaganda that was created. But now we have propaganda coming at us from all different directions all the time. And anyway, so our problem today is nothing new. And there were artists, too, who were critical of America and small-town ideas. So this government privatism or this isolationism, this inward turning that came about post-World War I created some interesting situations. One of those was the Tennessee legislature passed something called the Butler Law. And the Butler Law made teaching Darwin's theory of evolution illegal in public schools. Remember the last slide we mentioned the erosion of family values? Well, here we go. Tennessee is addressing it. They believe that Darwin's theory of evolution is causing problems with morals, family values, that sort of thing, because Darwin's theory of evolution goes against our religious theory of creationism. So, one teacher was talking about it with some fellow teachers, and they kind of challenged him to break the law and see what happened. So he did. He taught Darwin's theory of evolution, and he was found guilty when it went to trial. He was fined $100, but the state Supreme Court threw out the verdict on a technicality. Still, it didn't make a change in the law. Also at this time, the Klan is reborn. So, you know, we are many years past the Civil War now, and you would think that society would move past this idea of racial superiority. However, It does not. The Klan actually creates this big marketing campaign, and several thousand join. The Klan then becomes a political force to reckon with because at local levels they start putting people in office that will instill Klan values. I thought you might find this interesting. During the same period of time that we're talking about in the 20s, Malvern actually chartered a Klan. If you can look close enough, and I don't know if you can at this slide, but the Klan charter was official on January 31st, 1922. And its charter members included several successful businessmen, including the county judge, a newspaper publisher, a minister, a local jeweler, and a hardware store owner, just to name a few. And just 2 days after this charter was issued, a man was lynched by a group of either 20 or 200. I mean, it's a big number, right? A big difference, but reports vary. And the men who killed this African American man were masked. And like I said, it happened just 2 days after the charter. This man was actually charged with harassing white women and white high school girls. And he was arrested on the charge, taken to jail, and the local sheriff decided it might be better if he moved him from Hot Spring County Jail to Clark County Jail in Arkadelphia. They were going to take him by car, but could not because protesters had the roads blocked. Then they sneaked him onto a train, hid him under a seat, but these masked men stopped the train, got on board, found him, dragged him out, and shot him. I believe they said he was shot 17 times. And then after that, the group just kind of dissipated and went on about their way. Near the end of the 20s, we have another presidential election on our hands. In the election of 1928, Republican Herbert Hoover confronted Democrat Alfred Smith, and Hoover won the election. And we will pick up with Hoover's time in office in our next chapter.